Live from the Washington, D.C. area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. Equality and sameness are not the same, are they? Diversity and inclusion buzzwords of this year. What is it and what is it not? That's what we'll talk about tonight. Good evening, I'm Nicolette DeVidar. There's a lot of talk about diversity and inclusion. It's at the forefront of almost all aspects of our lives and debates, politically, socially, organizationally, and sometimes environmentally, though not as much as it should be quite yet. We've still got ways to go. But what is diversity actually? What does inclusion mean? Many people think of diversity and inclusion automatically in terms of race and gender, and as a fairly new political or social idea. Well, that's what one could conclude when reading the many tweets and listening to comments from politicians, media, and organizations. But fact is, diversity and inclusion are not new concepts. They're neither novel nor a new idea. Diversity and inclusion are as old as the planet itself. They're key to sustainability, anchored in the very fabric of nature herself, part of every living system and every living organism. When diversity is absent, ecosystems stop functioning. They die. The planet dies. So how come that so few make the connection? And diversity inclusion is so difficult to grasp. And how could we miss and forget about this important fabric that nature has been showing us all along with all the progress humanity supposedly made? And even today, most people associate diversity and inclusion as a social, political, and workplace issue, making it a problem to solve versus seeing it as the natural solution to the many problems we face. Is that because most of our systems in place are contrary to nature? So we take you in a different direction tonight, showing you how diversity is the very makeup of a sustainable planet. Get ready for a wild journey. Joining me tonight is Jonathan Suhr, President and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, an organization that works with schools, business, and communities to achieve success through inclusion. We've got Don Hill, sound artist and designer, writer, broadcaster, musician, and interactive media producer. He's a former national host of Canada's CBC Radio 1's Tapestry, and his newest work, Story Trees, is a modified responsive architecture and interactive online exhibition, and he'll talk more about what this exactly is later in the show. We've got Tim Giesecke, president of Agri-Resource Strategies, an organization that helps to bridge the social and economic gap between the agriculture and environmental communities. He worked with the Chesapeake Bay Environmental Certification and the United Nations Foundation Solutions from the Land. Welcome, all three of you. It's great to have you on. And for our viewers, if you're just wondering that we talk about diversity and that all guests are Caucasian tonight, that was simply a matter of guest availability this evening in the relative background space we want to dive in, and what I would like to take you on that journey to make the connection between diversity and sustainability. So, all right, all three of you, thanks so much for coming on. So diversity and inclusion is kind of a hotly debated concept. What I found so interesting is when you ask people what it actually is, there is a lot of misunderstanding around diversity. Most people really struggle in defining it. So I'm going to ask you straight out, and I'm going to start with you, Jonathan. How would you define diversity?
Well, thanks, Nicolette. It's good to be with you. At the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, we think about diversity as being the presence of difference. So you have two people, you have two organisms, you have two of anything, and you're going to have some level of difference in terms of identity, background, worldview when we're talking about people. My colleagues on the panel can certainly speak to it in terms of an environmental perspective. I think one of the challenges we have is that those two people may not necessarily get along. They don't work well together if they're not well facilitated and guided. So you're plopping different people together. You have some level of diversity.
Mm-hmm. Don, what's your take? How would you define diversity?
Well, I'll tell you how I wouldn't define it.
That was actually the next question, but if you want to get ahead.
I'm so sorry for robbing your thunder, but any kind of monoculture, in nature especially, is doomed to one pandemic or any kind of disruption. And diversity allows you to essentially withdraw just the day-to-day thing of being alive and human on a planet in a universe which we really don't understand a lot about. So diversity has been given to us as a tool for survival. Monocultures, which we like because there's certainty there. Mm-hmm. Diversity doesn't guarantee certainty. And if I could put this into a frame of reference that is philosophical, it's Sunday, we can do this, okay? As we go into Hegelian philosophy, those German guys from way back when, well, they gave us something we're dealing with today, and that is thesis, an idea, antithesis, a reaction to that idea, and in that collision of these stories that people live inside comes synthesis. What diversity does, though, is it creates the conditions what David Bohm, the physicist, was pointing toward. And that was thesis, antithesis equals uncertainty. And that's okay. And that's diversity in my frame of reference.
So diversity, in your view, always goes with uncertainty?
Yeah, I think it has to, because it has to do with relationships. And just like male-female relationships, you start off in one direction and you throw the dice in some cases, and you say, maybe 47, 50 years later, 47 of mine, I'm going to be married to the woman who was my girlfriend when I was in my 20s. So that it wasn't a monoculture, let's point this out. Mm-hmm. You are growing with that person as they grow with you. And you can never take that for granted. And diversity is like that. It's a constant working at, as opposed to monocultures. You just learn a system, a franchise, there's chicken over here, you put this over here, and then boom, you got yourself a living. And as a consequence of that, if food tastes change or culture changes, what happens to that monoculture? Now, enough of me talking. I want to hear the other guys.
All right, we move on to Tim. Tim, how do you define diversity?
Well, I think it's very important how you premised it. Is it's so different in different sectors and cultures and ways of life, and so as I traveled my career path, I did start in the ecological world, mm-hmm. and so diversity is biodiversity and ecological diversity, and it's about really the growth of niches and nodes within ecosystems, and so it's. We sometimes think diversity maybe prevents growth for some reason, but diversity really is the outspringing of growth of a natural ecosystem. So to describe diversity as maybe an outcome of growth, of natural growth. And then, and it was even just like in fact, a colleague, Thomas Lovejoy, I believe, coined the term biodiversity in the 80s as he worked in the Amazon, and you observed these things, and biological diversity became biodiversity, and then, but I think that recognition where it's being introduced in a more socially cultural way rather than an ecological way is, it brings that topic forth, and then how do we bring it back in the conversation into the ecological diversity? And then, and as my career advanced, I did get into more of these, economic theories related, and also governance theories. Mm-hmm. And really we're seeing a diversity in governance as we interconnect online. So I think diversity is a platform for growth in a direction. So back to my kind of earlier definition, it's the diversity is kind of the expansion of niches and nodes within an ecosystem that we work.
But you see the problem from what we just heard. So we asked 3 people and everyone defined it slightly differently, leaving everyone in the gray space that's so hard to grasp. Is that what we struggle with, Jonathan?
I think it's part of the challenge, but I think it's also the opportunity. So you named in your introduction that this isn't a problem to be solved. I think it's an opportunity to be realized, that if we're able to create spaces where differences of opinion and perspective, worldview, priorities are able to figure out how to navigate things together, then we're able to come up with new and innovative solutions. If all three of us began this show by saying the exact same thing in the exact words, you wouldn't have a very interesting conversation. This show would end pretty quickly. And so
absolutely.
I think this is an opportunity to be able to figure out how do we leverage diversity rather than see it as a problem to be fixed.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. Let's move into what diversity is not, because I think there is a huge push out there right now in trying to define diversity where it's kind of limited mostly for what most people think it is. It's kind of race and it's gender and maybe age. That's kind of like where it goes for most people. So there is a big push for an approach that looks for sameness. So looking for what makes us similar, whether what actually makes us different. And you said in your intro, Jonathan, to you, diversity is the presence of the different. So if we look for sameness, aren't we falling into the trap of achieving exactly the opposite of what we're actually trying to do?
Yeah, I think there is at times an overemphasis on the ways that folks are similar. I think that comes from good intentions. So certainly there is a way in which people will say things like, oh, I'm colorblind, or oh, I don't see difference. And I think their intention is good. The reality is, though, that by doing that, they are negating the reality that we have different lived experiences, that we have different perspectives, that we have different upbringings. And so even though the intent may be positive, the impact or consequences that it glosses over and sometimes outright negates the reality of our different lived experiences, which aren't something that we should be putting down or negating or ignoring. In fact, when we realize those things, then we have the opportunity to live together more authentically.
I need to chime in here. Can I do this, Nicolette?
Yeah,
you okay with this? Okay, it's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm coming in from Canada here, okay? I want to talk to you about this word sameness, and I want to have a bit of a conversation around this. You heard me rant, as I did in the beginning here, about monocultures, okay? There is a problem of an epidemic of sameness, okay? And I choose those words very carefully, all right? Mm-hmm. So what is required is a respectful collision of stories. And your truth is not my truth, but we have this one shared truth. We live on this thing called the planet. And last time I checked, the people who were last really off planet was like what? Almost 50 years ago? I'm meaning on the moon. And we don't do very well in space, meaning our bodies will break down. Any fantasy of people with this genomic body that we've got right now, going to Mars, knowing full well in 3 or 4 months, exposed to gamma rays and God knows what, that our physiology breaks down and cognition breaks down. So we are stuck here. This is the spaceship. And a lot of these conversations are going on, and I will shut up after this, has to do with the inability to listen very carefully and to slow down as things get quicker and quicker and quicker. Now, social media is basically a drug dispenser. It's not a very good drug. It's called cortisol. It tenses it up. The economy of attention retains you. And it is crying, it's saying, imploring, you must think like this. That's an epidemic of sameness. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I definitely think that's a good point. But I also would like to get back to what you said, because I think we need to also learn that there is a difference between truth, like perceiving truth with a small t, because it's always subjective. I see things very differently than you do and as everyone else does. But then there is such a thing as truth with a capital T, which means that's how all living organisms function and operate, because there is a basic, there are universal principles in there how they operate.
I would strongly suggest that you're correct about that, but you need to add one other dimension. The truth is, if you make an error in nature, you die. And epigenetic memory, which is the movement of these experiences, move along the continuum of nature and bringing us to the present. Mm-hmm. I think we're in one of those moments right now where we're into a great learning here. Now, it could be negative, it could be positive. Mm-hmm. And I do hope that made sense. And if it didn't, I better be quiet.
Tim, what do you think? Are we barking up the wrong tree? You heard already, Don already talked about monoculture, so you work in the agriculture field. I'm sure you deal with this all the time. When we look for the monocultures, which is actually devastating for the environment, with the approach of sameness, are we barking up the wrong tree?
No, I mean, right. The monoculture is probably, it applies across sectors, but owned probably by agriculture and in the, since the early 70s on forward, we really decreased the diversity of our landscape. And so, from that perspective, the opposite of diversity, it was efficiency. We strive for efficiency by pushing diversity back. And like I mentioned earlier, diversity is the natural outgrowth of a natural system. So it wants to be diverse. The world moving forward wants to be diverse. And so, monoculture, efficient monocultures would be the reverse or the opposite of diversity from many perspectives, even economically. I know the big box retailers are less diverse than a lot of little stores. And then from the social political end, why does that occur? I mean, how has agriculture been able to take on the risk of monoculture? Because it's very risky, because it's all your eggs are in one basket. I mean, that's obviously an agriculture saying. As you risk mitigation or risk exposure is part of a monoculture. So I think diversity gives us a lot, and we haven't. We're still comfortable with the efficiencies of not being diverse economically speaking.
But Tim, there was something very peculiar in terms of, as an economist, I'd like you to think about this. And Jonathan, please do. And I've actually did a documentary about some of what you're speaking. What happened was, for example, I'll give you a quick example. The apples that you often get at your local grocery store, if you think about them, there's like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like Granny Smith being the exotic one, the green one, that kind of thing. And if you go back into the early part of the 20th century, there were hundreds of varieties of apples, but they were sold at the local level, and they could not export them because they'd spoil. So what happened was we pushed that kind of agriculture simply because we were able to do what became a phenomenon of the 1970s, which was two things: just-in-time delivery and those cargo ships with those big boxes, right? And that was what do you call that? I mean, Jonathan, that was 50 years ago, and we forgot that we had diversity. But then what we did was we had diverse markets that were not available to us before.
Yeah, but that goes back to what Tim just said, that we push diversity out basically.
But this is a different diversity. This is economic diversity.
Yes, it is. But the point is, we push diversity out so that we would have more efficiency. And to take this further, I want to bring actually up an important point that I think we're doing this all the time, because that sounds to me, you get a linear answer to a nonlinear problem, or a nonlinear to a nonlinear world. And when we say we have everything is efficient, when I look at the language that has just been changed in Congress, for example, to incorporate more diversity, but basically by annihilating the differences, there are certain words you cannot use anymore. You can't use father, you can't use son, you can't use daughter. So aren't we taking exactly that same mistake that we made before and push diversity out so that we would make things more efficient? So in other words, would we give a linear approach to a nonlinear issue? Jonathan, I'm going to call you on this one.
Yeah, I think that the intent behind what is happening in Congress, and we can debate whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing, is actually to choose language that is broader and that then becomes more inclusive, to recognize the fullness of folks' identities, the fullness of family structures, et cetera. And so I'm not sure that necessarily results in greater efficiency. It does result in more people being included if we recognize how these decisions are coming about and what the opportunity is that comes from them. I do think that there is a question about efficiency and whether that's the ultimate goal here, that organizations that are efficient, or I could think about a human resources professional who, for example, said, I would never hire only people who graduated from the same exact program at the same college with the same professors, because if that's what our company did over and over and over again, we would never see things from different, we would never be able to solve new problems. Ultimately, someone else who did hire folks who had different perspectives, different backgrounds, would come up with a better solution than what we have. And so there are times where efficiency might be faster in the short term, but in the long term, you're going to lose the race, so to speak, because you're not seeing that next possible solution.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to talk more about this, but coming back to that language on Congress, so aren't we, by using this, and yes, we all understand the intent, but aren't we annihilating the differences, which is exactly what you said at the beginning, though? It's the understanding and respecting and loving and embracing the differences. So if we just push them out and pretend they're not there, even if the intent may be right, then aren't we losing the differences?
This is public television, right? Can we use large language? I have something to add here that might change the complexion of your question, okay? Now, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire was written by a guy named Gibbon a couple hundred years ago. And it's 8 texts. In other words, you can download it from archive.org.
But I really would like Jonathan to answer his question first.
Okay, yeah. Sure. But make sure you come back to me on this.
Yes, I will come back to you.
And language.
Mm-hmm. And language.
Sure.
I will come back to you.
Yep. So I think, Nicolette, there is the possible risk that by choosing words that are broader, we are oversimplifying the differences. I do think that in the short term, I think part of what's happening and part of the intent was to be able to recognize the broader variety, for example, as it relates to gender. And so recognizing that we need to choose words that are broader and more inclusive than having words that are specifically gendered. But there is the risk, I'll acknowledge that what you said, that 20, 50 years from now, if that continues, there could be a way that glosses over the recognition of different identities that fall under whatever that umbrella
Because it's kind of like using the same thing with the apples. We had all these variety of apples, but to make them actually so that we could transport them, we would lose the variety of the apples. And I think that's exactly, to me, this is exactly the same mistake we've made over and over again, looking for a short-term solution, pushing the actual thing out. It's a linear answer to a non-linear world, and complexity can't be solved with simplifying it or streamlining it. That's exactly at the heart of the matter.
And there's horrible downstream effects. So this is I'm jumping in here, okay? I'm jumping in. All right. So Gibbon wrote, to review, Rise and Fall, Collapse of the Roman Empire. And in the end, I'm paraphrasing here, the reason why the Roman Empire failed was because the Roman Empire became so broadly distributed that at the periphery of the empire, nobody understood in terms of the language. It shifted so much from the center of the empire in meaning to the fringes. And I'm reflecting a bit on what's happening today, is nobody in the end really understood what it meant to be a Roman. It was a language problem.
Yeah, it is a language problem.
Point number 2 that's connected to this has to do with our best intentions. Mm-hmm. And I think Tim will back me up on this one. And perhaps, Jonathan, you will do too. I work with a lot of research scientists to explain them to the great unwashed and slightly showered, which is you and I in media, and for those of us who work in public sector broadcasting. And the best intentions at the time were this thing with the pinyon or pine beetle, which was all over the place and wiping out forests. And some very smart people said, we've got a pesticide that can really be effective against the pine beetle. And they applied it. And guess what happened? It was really, really worked. But it also killed off all the predators of the pine beetle and made the situation worse. So we got to be careful about the stories we tell each other and these good intentions. They can backfire. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Tim, you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, I think, as you introduced it, the topic is fairly new in the cultural sense, but been around for the biological sense for a while. And then what I found interesting is how we have tried to solve that with Don's example there, and in monoculture and agriculture. And then you discussing, are we trying to do that same linear efficiency piece in here, and we as in civilizations often make the same mistakes several times, because the cultural biodiversity individuals haven't maybe experienced the agricultural biodiversity, and they're going to have to make the same mistakes again. So I think aligning these parallels and seeing where they started in history when trying to solve the problem, because I feel the ecological industry, if you want to call it that, is pretty far ahead on this, and I think the challenge even in the agriculture community now is, how do you tell people efficiency is not the top priority? And that's a very hard sell, except that, as I think Jonathan mentioned, it's at the cost of resiliency to the system later on. And so how do we, the Southern Corn Blight in the 70s was a good example of a monocultural singular gene that collapsed the corn industry a year. They worked their way out of that. Well, we're going to do that again and again. So where is that efficiency versus resiliency line?
Yeah, actually, that brings up a really good point. I want to shift a little bit and look at how can we actually learn, what can we learn from nature? How does nature deal with that? Why do we need diversity? So since you're on, Tim, you're going to take the first step.
Sure. We need it to reduce risk, and covering risk is getting very expensive.
Explain to our viewers the correlation between reducing risk and diversity, because I don't think it's clear to a lot of our viewers.
Sure. So, and maybe I'll go back to the example, the Southern Corn Blight. The same parent material was used to create hybrids across the country. It went great, efficiently. Yields were very high. They were moving up anyway, and you had to compete with your neighboring farmer to plant the greatest hybrids with the same parent material, and everything was going along fine. A very efficient system. But then, as mentioned, diversity is an outcrop of the natural growth of nature. Some organism is going to take advantage of this monoculture in front of it, and once it starts, it takes off. So resilience is the ability of a system to take a hit and keep going. The economic system of 2008 took a big hit and did not keep going very well. And the corn blight, they had a scramble. And so I think we can continually see where systems are efficiently moving forward. They take a hit. And then, we'll hear our COVID situation. We weren't prepared. We took a hit. We scrambled, and I think there's enough examples now that we can see efficiency systems taking hits, and how long does it take to recover, and where do we want to, where's that line of efficiency and resiliency? It's not black and white, and it's a values choice and a risk management choice.
Jonathan, you have some data on resiliency also in the workplace? Because I know you also work, what you're doing, you also work with diversity in the workplace. And you mentioned at the beginning that, for example, hiring people always from the same background or from the same schools, as you say, there is a lack of different perspectives and so on. Are there any statistics, Jonathan, from your work in terms of how organizations perform better and are more resilient when they have included diversity?
Certainly, there's a lot of work that if folks would turn to Harvard Business Review, for example, and look at the impact of diverse and well-facilitated teams compared to monocultural teams that can show more innovative, positive results. Dr. Nancy Adler, who does organizational behavior work, has a lot of this. And what she shows is if you think about three different groupings. So if you have a diverse team that is plopped together, that is not supported, that is just simply told, okay, have at it. They don't like each other. They don't work well together. They are woefully ineffective. They are diverse and dysfunctional. In the middle, you have teams that are monocultural, where you don't have a lot of difference. They do better than the dysfunctional teams, but they don't ultimately improve their company's bottom lines as well as they could. The diverse and inclusive and well-facilitated teams are the ones that are more collaborative, more innovative, more creative. They come up with the best solutions. But what I think is really interesting about the research on this is that those teams that are making the best decisions, when asked about their experience, they self-report saying things like, it was okay, took a long time, wasn't the best group I've been a part of. The teams that are in the middle, that are making middle of the road decisions that are monocultural, they love themselves. They say it was the best group I've been a part of. I would love to go back. Wonderful experience. Yay, us. It goes back to what we said earlier about sort of complexity and nuance, that it's not as challenging for them. And so therefore they like it, even though they're not making the best decisions for their companies. Study after study after study shows.
It's interesting you should bring up Nancy Adler from McGill University in Montreal, a former colleague of mine at the Banff Center for the Arts and Leadership.
Fabulous.
And we were working a little over a decade ago, before the big meltdown, on a couple of things. And what hopefully you're familiar with Nancy's work on bringing in arts and design. Okay. Now there's another area that we've utterly misunderstood in the dominant culture. The area of philanthropy, you're at a nonprofit, so you understand that you have to look after your patrons. And those patrons have a very firm view of how things ought to be. And sometimes you have to guide them through a process that is difficult, and sometimes at odds with what they would like to do. So in the areas of the arts and design, we were working toward the idea of what we mean by diversity. And it doesn't necessarily square with what you just said. And I don't mean to be a contrarian. I'm just trying to add to the conversation. And by all means, you can tell me two words and they're not happy motoring if they upset you later, not on public TV, okay? But what it gets down to is this, is that I'll use the Arctic metaphor that we used. And that is, we're in Canada and we have this thing called the Arctic. You have Alaska, but we got lots of Arctic. So in the Arctic, where survival is key, what they mean by diversity is that when you have a situation changing, like the weather, or you're having to do battle, you bring in the appropriate person who is in diversity, is you consult with the others about who is the best person to do this job at this particular time. Is it this guy, that woman, and women play a very key role in Inuit and Inuit life in northern Canada. Or is it this person over here who's like 14 years old, okay? And they have a very short discussion about this, and then the person is approached, and they say, well, we're having a war, and we've chosen you to be a war chief. Who told you that? Well, George Patton did. George Patton told you that. Yes. Who else told you that? Eisenhower. Eisenhower told you that? Well, I guess I'm the best person to be the war chief, okay? That's what is meant by diversity. These are high performance people agreeing amongst each other at the goal that's been set in front of them. Whenever you have governance imposing values and saying, thou shalt do this and thou shalt that, Gibbons comes to mind. We create the conditions for unintended consequences. So I just throw that on the table. So this is some of the work we were doing over a decade ago. It was interrupted, but it's the same as the pandemic is now. And I would love to see other people taking this forward as we redefine what we mean by arts and design, especially after post-pandemic.
Oh, I totally agree. But really what becomes clear in this whole discussion is that diversity has so many dimensions. It has so many dimensions to it, and it does affect almost every aspect of our life. So, but let me ask all three of you, why are we so afraid of the diverse? And that's actually whether you hire, and I'm taking your example, Don, that you just mentioned, who's the best person for the job. When you look very often at how jobs are filled nowadays, you have the job molds, you have the job descriptions, the 5 pages, as I kept saying, Jesus has already a job, but nevertheless, we try to push everyone in that same yes. mold. And when someone has a diverse background, rather than seeing that this diverse background has something to add, people are afraid of it because they're not sure what the person can and can't do. So how do we navigate this whole mountain of fear, so to speak, and actually get more comfortable with diversity to actually see the advantage that's in there?
I'm going to be very brief about this because I certainly want to hear from Tim and Jonathan on this. I'm the child of an immigrant, okay? Most of my family ended up in New York City, and my mother married my father up in the North Shore of Lake Huron. That's why I'm a Canadian, but I spent a lot of time in New York, and I understand the American experience. And initially, immigrants coming into the country, then as is now, are generally feared for reasons having to do with survival. And it's an instinct that is very, very human. And I don't think we can filter that out. I think we have to accept that that exists and then build from that. I don't have a solution. All I have is an observation.
Jonathan, you have something to? I used to work in personnel management, and I actually would make it as a recommendation for most people to hire exactly the opposite of what they were inclined to do, just to shake it up and get more different viewpoints and more different people, and breaking loose from your normal way of how you make decisions.
But you just elected a president that is being replaced right now who is hired to do exactly that. Have I got that wrong?
Oh, I'm not going to go into the election. Nice try, but we're not going to go there.
Okay, sorry, I'll stop.
Nicolette, I think that I'll avoid the politics as well, but I think that there is a clear sense at least in the context where I work in Virginia, that inclusion requires intention. And if I'm not willing to put in that extra work and that effort to navigate nuance and complexity, it's much more comfortable. It's much easier to be around folks where I'll be willing to give folks the benefit of the doubt, where we have maybe similar context or upbringing, or I think we do, where I can universalize my experience and not bump into things. And so I think that the tendency to be around those with whom we have things in common is something that has been certainly socialized over time. I also think a lot of this is based on how our society has been set up in the United States. So certainly we have patterns of immigration, as Don noted, but we don't necessarily have a lot of proximity to difference. Mm-hmm. If we look back in the early 1900s and even before that, we have ethnic enclaves where different groups are speaking their own languages, where folks have their cultural foods, things like that over time. Even as that has evolved, if we look at the makeup of our schools in Virginia, for example, we still see wide racial and ethnic segregation, both in terms of how our neighborhoods are set up, which affects neighborhood schools, and in terms of within a building, how folks socialize. And so there are some things that are patterns of behavior that keep us from being able to really appreciate and value the extra effort that might be needed to get that diverse work team that you described, Nicolette, and therefore we don't get the benefit of what that team might be able to provide.
Mm-hmm. And actually I found this very interesting. So I'm European, and I noticed that very same thing what you just said, Jonathan. It really struck me at first that you have a country where you have so many people with so many different backgrounds, and yet there is so little understanding of one another, and trying to have more of this embracing this embracing cultural understanding. And I give you an example. In Europe, and I'm sure that's part of our history, with all the wars we had and all the, somebody conquered this country and another person moved boundaries this way. But in any case, I do think we have come to love each other for our differences. So, and there are lots of jokes out there that would say, Italians are great cooks, and there were even T-shirts made of all the distinct stereotypes. And while stereotyping is always bad, usually there is a grain in it of some things where you would say, yeah, there's some sort of truth to it. But the point is, it's not bad. I think it becomes bad when you become judgmental about it and say this person is, whatever your judgment is, worthy, or you don't see this person as an equal because they're different. But how do we navigate this particular fear factor? Is that because we're so afraid of talking to each other about this?
I think that's absolutely a big part of it, that folks are socialized, especially I think white people in the United States are socialized that it is worse to say the wrong thing than it is to say nothing at all. And so, I certainly don't want to be called racist. I don't want to be thought of as being an unkind or hateful person. And so a lot of times that tendency then becomes that, well, just don't say anything if you don't know the right thing to say, or stay in your own corner, or avoid these types of conversations. And so even again, it goes back to the intent versus impact we were talking about earlier. Even if the intent is positive there to not be hurtful to other people. The consequence is that we aren't able to build deep, authentic relationships. Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative and wrote a book called Just Mercy that was turned into a movie, he has a framework that he talks about which moves from proximity to relationship to empathy to justice. And he says it's not a straight line. It's not necessarily the case that we're going to get there. But if we don't have proximity, then we can't have the possibility of relationship. And if those relationships don't become authentic, then it's hard to create empathy. And if we don't have a sense of true empathy, really understanding one another's experiences, then we can't lead to justice. All of that is really hard to do in 280 characters. So we really need to think about how do we build in the time and effort and energy to do this, because it's not going to come through a quick interaction or through something we see on social media.
So is political correctness counterproductive, or political correct language counterproductive?
I think political correctness gets overly used to shut down conversation. I think that there is a way in which that folks are wanting to be considerate and wanting to be thoughtful and kind. So using language that somebody asks me to use might be, folks might say, oh, well, you're just being politically correct by using a different label. Well, I think I'm being thoughtful and considerate. I do think there are times where the way political correctness is used to shut down conversations, or we don't talk about politics. We just did this on the show. We don't talk about politics. It's not polite to do that in public settings.
No,
so
we talk about politics. We just didn't want to talk about the going to the election because I didn't want to get off track, which I'm sure our viewers would appreciate, because we talk about diversity and sustainability.
Definitely. But I think that there is a way, workplaces are navigating this, and certainly have, as we think about the last 6 months and the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests. There are workplaces that said, we don't talk about these things at work. And others who said, if we don't talk about them, that doesn't mean our employees aren't feeling these issues. And so we need to say something and create space to say something. I think the tendency to political correctness to avoid these issues has hampered our ability to really address them.
Tim?
I'm a longtime broadcaster, and what you pointed out is the issue that we're dealing with right now. And my background, just for those of you who can't know, because you're in the United States, is I've been a national radio host. I've done phone-in radio and these kinds of things. So I'm familiar with many mediums of exchange. What you just described as social media is a relatively new medium. And what happened was, if you think about it, is people learned how to game the system, including active measures, which is a fancy way of saying propaganda by foreign actors. It's real, but it isn't necessarily just tied to Russia. It basically is approximately 70 to 80 nations around the world who are gaming the system to get all Americans upset at each other. So don't take my word for it. Investigate those two words, active measures. Now, point two, what's the workaround, okay? Right now, my colleagues and I are working on a new interactive medium which gauges your impressions and adjusts the content so you can actually hear my second outrageous statement. We're not listening to each other. We're talking at each other. So we're working on it right now. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it a bit, but I'm sorry, I'm crashed in there. Nicolette, please take over.
Oh, no, that's no worries. It's an organic conversation.
It sure is.
Tim, yes, it is. Tim, do you think that political correctness is counterproductive in terms of what we're trying to do?
Yeah, that's a challenge. It's some people look at it as being, respectful, as I think Jonathan mentioned, and others look at it as censorship. So I think that's, that one's, again, we had talked earlier about sustainability getting its own definition by many people, and political correctness gets somewhat like that. But I'll go back to I think your original question there, and build on Jonathan's comment there. I think it was his proximity to empathy. Continuum there. And, I heard this, what was it, several years ago, that, America, a young, spacious country, always was able to, the populations were able to move away from each other from conflict. Europe was crowded. You had to deal with issues where we've had the luxury, if you want to call it that, to move away from conflicts. And we never really had a chance to grow up, if you want to call it that. So that's kind of one piece. But then on the other end of the spectrum, I think we've all our careers have overlaid this area where in our early career, if people had multiple careers, diverse resumes, it was almost frowned upon. And
totally. People wanted a cookie cutter resume. No
now
question.
if you have an undiverse resume, they're like, "What are you doing?"
Because they didn't know what to do with the person. There was no understanding.
Where is your?
But there was no understanding.
Interdisciplinary studies, like master of all, jack of none. Right?
Yeah, exactly. All jack of trade. But I think that comes from a lack of taking a whole systems perspective on things, because we're so fragmented and everybody only looks at their little view from where they're sitting. The society has really shattered in so many different pieces, which makes it so much more difficult for us to solve the challenges that we have right now. And I actually that's a great shift to the next segment I want to talk about. And this is, how do we start taking a whole systems view on these things, and how do we approach diversity and inclusion from a systemic perspective? And Tim, you were on, but I'm going to call you right back on. So in terms of from a systemic or from an ecosystems perspective, how do we approach that?
So some work, Reitel and I can't remember the author, but coined the phrase "wicked problems" in the 70s, and in a 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to kind of delve into those and really kind of unfold that, and and they said the challenge, as we become more interconnected, as we are systems-based culture, these wicked problems will always be with us. So how do we get that mindset around addressing complex problems? And I think there's a real education challenge here to present systems thinking to our youth and to our adults, because linear machine thinking from the industrial era is that that myopic, here's your task, here's your job, here's your resume, everything looks good. Where we're now my career has generally, it looks like a meandering river, but I've always had the same focus. I've always wanted to look at the economic and ecological nexus in agriculture, and to do that, I've had to work with local government, state government, nonprofits, my own business, research and writing, and I think we have to encourage and support that meandering path to outcomes. And just one other piece I think that's emerging that I focused on is, and I mentioned earlier, is governance. I think to solve these complex problems, we have to actually start with understanding the governance of the transaction or the process, rather than trying to fix it and then try to figure out what the governance means at the end. I really do think governance is that inner working of decision-making process that needs to be closer to the front of our problem solving.
Yeah, governance is a big issue. There is no question. And actually, for our viewers also, I wonder, do you know what a whole system is, or what whole systems thinking is? Because most people actually have no idea when you talk about systems thinking what this is. So let's clarify here for a second. Don, can you give us an overview of what systems thinking is?
Well, I had the pleasure of working with an economist, Robert Theobald, who's pretty much forgotten these days. He was one of the folks who was championing the idea of the guaranteed annual income back in the time of Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society, etc. He was born abroad. He was Scottish, but he was an American, and very, very bright guy. And he talked about what we're talking about now. And where it all lands at the end of the day is we're making all of this up as we go along now. A lot of the ideas that we had before in terms of systems thinking are rooted in the 60s and 70s and arguably the 80s as well. They sort of went adrift at sea, and nobody really knows what that actually means in process. But what we do know is that it will be digital, and that it will cohere and around a set of ideals which will be coded and will be algorithmic. And I concur in the sense that we do need to pay attention to this. But there's also a few ideas that we may need to jettison. So Bob Theobald, if you want to look him up with your search engine of choice, was hesitant to really articulate in the fullness of what people demanded about what we mean by systems thinking. But generally speaking, it has to do with this very simple idea. Think of a tree. Think of the ground that it's rooted in. You have to understand, for that tree to survive, it must be as rooted in the sky as much as it is rooted in the soil to survive. And that's systems thinking. I hope that's helpful.
Tim, can you back him up on this one?
Yeah, so sure. So systems, simple systems, complicated systems, complex systems, I think is a good continuum to work with. And complicated, think of that as what people make up the rules, where complexity derives from simple principles working together. So maybe here's a good example is birds murmuring. How birds flock together and stay close and don't crash and all that. A gentleman tried to explain complicated versus complex systems. And complicated on a computer, you could program each individual boids, as he called them, and create this flock. Or a complex system, he gave each of those boids, as he called them, 3 rules. Merge toward your neighbor, do not touch your neighbor, and avoid objects. And so out of there, these murmurs are created. This complexity emerges from simple rules with complex relationships. And they're not complicated. The core is to figure out those simple rules that are hidden in that complexity.
Yeah, which kind of is a mixture, I guess, of cybernetics and patterns. There are certain patterns that are the same, the patterns that are in most living organisms, and there are structures that are the same in most living organisms, or actually in all living organisms.
So yeah, just the key is to figure out those simple rules within the complex systems, and they're hidden.
Mandelbrot set. Like Mandelbrot, and Norbert Wiener was the person who coined the term cybernetics way back in the 1940s. And Marvin Minsky took issue with it, and we've been struggling with these things. Go ahead.
Sure. So a rocket is a complicated system. It's not complex. A tree is a
say a system is the pattern that connects?
The system. Jonathan, why don't you answer that?
Let's just say it's pattern recognition.
Okay.
Okay, in the sense that we do have, and I'm robbing Jonathan's thunder here, but we have a problem as human beings. We have a limited bandwidth. We can't see sometimes. There's something known as confirmation bias. We know what that is. I think we do know what that is. We seek out things that confirm our own bias of how we want to, and as a consequence of that, we can't see what's maybe on the periphery, and we need to pay attention to those things. Mm-hmm. The second piece is known as motion-induced blindness. It's a test. Look it up on the internet. Actually, you can go to my website. I have it there. I'm not trying to promote it. I'm just saying this is valuable to show you just how fragile our system of attention is. Mm-hmm. As soon as we are attentive to one thing, even though it crosses your path, you can see it later, we can't see it. It's a limitation of the bandwidth and our cognition, in the sense that we will, and it's survival again. We have to pay attention to what we need to pay attention to. I hope that's helpful.
So, Jonathan, what do you think the biggest challenge and obstacles are going forward in making diversity and inclusion a much more understood and lived thing in our societies?
In some ways, I think it actually builds on the conversation Tim and Don were just having, that in some ways we need to think about how these issues have manifested over time in much more complex ways than folks want to. I often will say that being nice is not enough. I hope that you're nice to other people. I try to be nice to other people. But the reality is that even if I'm nice to you, Nicolette, and you're nice to me, that doesn't change the reality that we're going to have different lived experiences based on how our society is set up, based on systems and structures that have been put into place, like the wage gap, laws that have created different expectations for folks based on various aspects of identity. And so we really need to look, I think, to both relationships and to policies. I've heard from folks over the years talk about the civil rights movement and some of the leaders who worked in the United States during that time to advance civil rights. And there was always a debate about, is this changing laws or is this about changing hearts? And ultimately, I think where they landed is it's both. That if you change hearts, but the laws aren't equitable and just, we're not going to have the outcome we want.
But I'm going to challenge this for a second here,
Please.
because if you live by your heart, you will not need a law because it understands everything. So you wouldn't need a policy for it either.
Danger. That's a cultural value. Be careful.
Well, that presumes that the laws that we live under are going to fairly and justly treat all of us. We're all working from the same starting place and the same systems, which I don't think in the United States is or has been the case. So I do think there's a way in which certainly personal values are critically important, and if we don't have them, changing laws isn't going to ultimately solve everything in and of itself. But if we do the relationship work and our laws are still unjust, we're not ultimately going to be able to get to true inclusion and equity either.
Now, doing the relationship work, though, what's the correlation? Well, we know already we have to become more comfortable in being challenged, and also probably more comfortable with yourself, because you can't really talk about yourself and approach these circumstances confidently if you get triggered by the slightest little thing, so to speak. So there's certainly a correlation of this. Do you see that that curve, so to speak, go up? So the more comfortable people are within themselves, the more authentic they are with who they are, the more comfortable they are in working in diverse environments?
Yes, I think that there is a connection between folks being, I would say, self-aware and having a sense of sort of self-confidence in being able to work with others. But I also would go back to the idea of there needing to be laws and policies. So if I am very self-aware and I am comfortable with myself, but in my workplace, the policies don't facilitate my ability to work well with others. So we are put in, not even competitive, but in unfair or inequitable pay grades, or we're pitted against one another rather than put in positions where we can be facilitated to work together, then I don't think that it's just about folks having resilience or self-awareness. I think it's also about making sure that we have policies and laws that support.
We're almost out of time, so I want to make this really quick here. If you all three had to give an advice to leaders, politicians, and people in daily life, we only have about a minute left, what would that be, Don?
Pay attention to what's happening in new digital mediums. They're emerging as we speak because we went through the first round, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and Congress and other agencies around the world are going to detorque that, and something new will be arising for public discussion.
Yes, and I actually did want to talk also a little bit about Don's story tree, but you can look up on our Facebook page more about that, what it actually says there. And you can also learn more a little bit about what Jonathan's organization is doing. But I want to move forward here. One more. Tim, what is your advice to people or leaders every day? It has to be quick.
Okay, that diversity is a natural outgrowth of living systems, and I think I'll go with Don's. The diversity what we're going to see in this electronic world is cryptocurrencies, and as well as governance, and the diversity will emerge in both of them.
Jonathan, and your last word on this?
Respond with wonder rather than judgment. If you hear something that doesn't make sense to you, listen more rather than immediately shut it down.
This is great. Thank you so much, all three of you. This was a great ending for it. Great conversation, lots of learning points, and I hope you took something out of this. And to respond and ask questions, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Smart Sustainability TV, and we see you next week. Have a good night.
Thank you much.